Just so you know, I've re-invited V because I think he would have something interesting to say. And in the absence of Dorobe,
Sure.
V in the past has been taking a position on the existence of a people and the replacement of people. He seemed to be somewhat fine with it in his discussion with Millennial Woes, and I'd like to ask him. But just before we move to that, we have a super chat by LM, $5 US, who says, "Isn't it weird we mainstream gays? Then 10 years later, children are taught to give blowjobs in school and that they are allowed to switch genders." So, Luke, what you've been presenting as an image of homosexuality is at least a partly environmental modification that may encourage homosexuality in our society, which did not exist before. Typically, the left likes to assume that you are born homosexual, and it seems that your discourse challenges this. And I would say, yes, the left doesn't have much of a solid demonstration that you are born homosexual and that you cannot do anything about it. Is that your belief that part of the homosexual population is made homosexual through their life experience?
Yeah, I would say the overwhelming majority that their life experience has an important role to play. So I'm not going to say 100% their life experience, but I would say the overwhelming majority. And there's a therapist, Mark Smith, who said something that I agree with. He said every single patient of his or client of his that was homosexual, of the men, every single one of them had a lousy relationship with his father. And so if you don't have a relationship with your father, you will grow up eroticizing male attention. And that's what I believe is the primary cause of homosexuality.
Now, one of the main values we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes is the right to exist, the right of people to exist, to perpetuate their genes and their culture, and to continue existing. Now, this right, as Luke pointed out, is potentially in conflict with other rights, with the right to pleasure and liberty. And V, you've been talking to Medinal Woes, and you were talking about immigration, and you seem to be saying you were defending a merit-based position on immigration and economy and economical success. Would you say, and it seemed from this discussion, V, that you were okay with the fact that a country would take the best doctors and the most intelligent people it could find and have them join the country based on merit. And it seemed that you didn't care that much about the potential replacement of the genetic pool of your country. V, do you think that a country has the right to decide that its genetic pool is not to be replaced by immigrants?
Well, I'm completely against massive immigration unchecked, right? Like when you get millions of people from, let's say, the African nations or, the Middle East into your nation. Obviously, there's going to be social conflicts. Obviously, there's going to be problems coming from that, both ideologically, economically, and other reasons. I don't think race is the biggest concern because I think a lot of people in the alt-right already point out that marriages between races are an exception and not the rule.
Yeah, but it seems that the race may be just a group identifier from a group of people who say we keep our land for ourselves. Do you take issue with this conception of race where I don't care if the white race is successful, but I'm part of it? And as being part of it, I'm willing to join these people into a group identity that says we exist. And not only will we maintain the group identity with our cultural transmission to our children, but we will ensure our individual success and the individual success of our genes with this. If you allow what people call today moderate immigration, which is often enough to reach threshold where the competing population could replace you, you are not standing not only by your group interest, but also by your individual interest. And people in some countries, such as Canada, France, Sweden, are at the top of the most risky position in terms of being fully replaced by their immigration, by the people who are coming as immigrant.
I think if you have a merit-based immigration that's so large that it kind of starts replacing your main population and your main demographic, the problem is not with the immigration, that's just a symptom. The problem you need to ask is why do you need to take people from the outside and you don't have enough people from the inside that would fit the positions that immigrants would fit. Because it's one thing to have like a small immigration, it's like, okay, we need like a couple more doctors. Let's fill this gap. We need a couple, or this scientist is really smart and he wants to work for us. Like, for instance, the case of the scientist who was a Nobel Prize winner, and because of a sexist joke, he had to leave the United States and find a job in Japan. And the Japanese nation went, well, he's not Japanese, but he's a very smart individual. We can have him here, right? And this is like the way normal things are. But when you need to take people from the outside to a degree, which is like replacing your main population, and it's affecting the ideology and the values of that nation, then the problem isn't with the immigration. The problem is, why is this happening? This is what you need to ask.
So V brings it back to values and culture being replaced, but it seems that he escapes the question about genes. Luke, do you stand more for the rights? Do you believe that it's only about maintaining your culture and maintaining your social system, or do you think people have an inherent right to defend the existence of their gene and the continuity of their lines of descent?
Yeah, what kind of cock doesn't care that whether or not his people lives? I mean, that is just so repellent. I just have such like contempt for someone who doesn't care whether or not his people live. And as far as like merit-based immigration, what you're doing then is you're importing a hostile elite. Why would you want to import a hostile elite? Why would you want to import Indian doctors, Indian coders? Like, why would you want to import people who are going to have a lot of negative feelings about you, and they're going to, screw you in ways that the 80 IQ person is never going to be able to do. Okay, the 80 IQ person can rape you, can kill you, can beat you up, but the 125 IQ person can, take your daughter, take your sister, can, just discriminate against you, kill your spirit. Like an 80 IQ crowd is never going to be able to organize a Holocaust. They're just not, smart enough to be able to, line you up and march you to the camps and gas you. But a 125 IQ crowd absolutely can, mount a Holocaust if they want to. So, culture is downstream from DNA. Even religion's downstream from DNA, let alone politics. Let alone, a civil society. So importing people with different DNA, you're just importing division, you're importing tension, you're importing conflict, you're importing, varying degrees of civil war. Why on earth would you want to import civil war?
I can answer that. I think the civil war is not caused by race, it's caused by ideology. And I can give you an example in Romania, where most of the nation is white. However, the ideology here will then focus on something smaller than race. It will focus on ethnicity. And on Romania, we do have a significant amount of Hungarians who are causing civil conflicts that are now starting to become more and more extreme, to the point where you have Romanians being beaten in their own country. And they're starting to ask for independence. And you can see the same happening in Spain with the Catalonians. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's the genetics that are the reason, but it's the ideology, which is going to have certain people take advantage and turn races against each other to the detriment of the nation. And you see the same happening with the far left, that are taking advantage of ideology. And they're trying to push this nonsense of multiculturalism, which turns citizens one against each other to the detriment of the state.
But is it possible, V, that the multiculturalism ideology that you talk about was introduced as a result of some immigration policies and not just as an emergent idea? Is it possible that multiculturalism itself emerges in society as a response to interest from that society dissociating themselves from the genetic success of its members?
Well, in Romania, it's not because of immigration. It's because the Hungarians were always here. And even if you would have like a society that's 100% white, 100% similar in ethnicity, you can have ideologies that take advantage of class. You can have ideologies that take advantage of religion. Any sort of difference between the citizens, you can have an ideologue and start, his own little version of how things should be. And they will blame all the problems of that nation on the aristocracy, on the bourgeoisie, on the non-Christians, or even if everyone is a Christian, you can have smaller denominations, and you can always like try to make this sort of infighting.
Gabriel Lopez, $20, says thumbs up for the king of live stream. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Luke, what is your position on multiculturalism in Western civilization?
Yeah, I think it's an absolute disaster. It's a death wish. It's like going into a blind alley and blowing some, dude with AIDS. That's what, multiculturalism is. Like, why on earth would anyone want to do that? I'll compromise it a little bit. I don't seek like a 100% white state. I'm fine with 90%, 95%. I've met fantastic Chinese, doctors. My life has been enhanced by knowing Koreans. My life has been enhanced by knowing blacks. So I don't want complete purity, but overall, I don't want minorities to be in such numbers that they can create schisms and divisions and low-level civil wars in a country. And as far as these conflicts being caused by ideology, most people aren't smart enough to understand an ideology. Like, ideology is the luxury of people with IQs over 115 who have time on their hands. What people understand is race.
What's your ideal percentage of immigrants then?
Well, Japan, I think, is doing pretty well, being a 99% Japanese society. Now, whites, particularly of Northern European heritage, are not nearly as ethnocentric as either the Japanese or the Jews. So, they're a little more easygoing, more open. So somewhere from, I'm fine above 85%, above 90%. I think that's a good ratio.
Garrett Green, $10 US, sends a question for Luke, which is very interesting. Why should I care about people just because we belong to the same ethnic group? I care about people who are intelligent and interesting and share some of my ideas and interests. What would you answer to this, Luke?
I think that's a great question. And it's true. We do tend to care more about people who share our interests or on similar level of education. But overall, the greatest predictor of how well people get along is genetic relatedness. Like a man and a woman who marry, where the genes are more disparate, the odds of the marriage lasting are considerably diminished. When the genes are more similar, without being a sister and brother, the marriage is going to last longer. We know that parents take better care of children who are theirs genetically than step parents take care. So genetic relatedness doesn't resolve all these questions, but it is more powerful than any other prism through which we're viewing these questions.
Can I ask a question? If you say that ideology is not as important as genes, I disagree with it, because in Russia, for instance, class was used to divide people. But you have the example of North Korea, South Korea. One nation is one of the best in the world, and another nation is one of the worst in the world, comparable to nations in Africa. You have cannibalism, you have mass starvation. You have almost the same genetic level between these people, I assume, right? Because they're all Koreans. The geographic, probably also similar, yet one nation is in collapse and is one of the worst nations in the world, and one nation is one of the best in the world. How do you explain this from the prism of genetics?
Well, I'm not sure that North Koreans and South Koreans do have genetics that are identical. I think there may be some significant differences. But I think you do raise a good question. Let's just say that the genetics is identical. Yeah, ideology counts for something. Like, race isn't everything. Like, I will say as a throwaway line, quoting from this 19th century Jewish novelist, race is everything, nothing else matters. But, that is not literally true. Ideology is important. But you'll notice that even these poor North Koreans are capable of building intercontinental ballistic missiles that can, perhaps, rain down on any part of the United States. So they are a ferociously competent people. They just have a particular governing system where, there's not a lot of consumer goods or human rights.
I just want to point out they blew up one of their own cities with those missiles.
Yeah, they're not perfect. I mean, United States, when it was testing nuclear weapons, they used to test them next to Mormon neighborhoods because the fallout would then go over the Mormon neighborhoods, and the Mormons were such great patriotic Americans, the military knew that they would never complain. So the Mormons died in the dozens from the nuclear fallout from our own incompetence, but because they were so patriotic, they didn't complain about it. Like
And
try,
to
try
V, I
doing
would,
that with Jews, we'll complain.
so to
Can we
V, I
find
would
out? Can
go
we
ahead.
find out the difference between percentages? Like, how much would you say genetics is important versus how much ideology is important? Because I gave you the example of Romania, where you have Hungarians. There's another example of, and by the way, this is something interesting. We have a gypsy population in Romania, right? While they do have a significant increase in crime, and they live in poverty, but I think this is because of their culture. They follow a culture different to the country at large. You don't see them asking for independence. You don't see them trying to create this separatist movement like the Hungarians or the Catalonians are doing. And I think the reason is because they don't have talking heads that fuel the flames of difference. Because, again, in my opinion, is that ideology, as long as it fuels the differences between people, which can be genetic, can be religious, can be ideological, can be class, there's when you have the conflict. You don't have the conflict if there aren't people doing that.
So
Oh,
V,
please let me answer that. Like
yeah,
the
yeah, go
average
ahead.
Gypsy IQ is like 70. I mean, these people are on average about as intelligent as a sub-Saharan African. Like there aren't a lot of gypsy neuroscientists. It's not culture. The culture is a reflection of their really low IQ. And why do they don't want independence? Because they know they're stupid and they couldn't, run a functioning state on their own, and that they're a parasite on a host nation, and they only survive as a parasite. It's just like African Americans, generally speaking, don't want their own nation because they realize they couldn't maintain the infrastructure. Like if you ask, and one white teacher did this, ask, black kids, what if white people went away and just left you to your own devices? The black kids will tell you we'd be screwed because you need white people, you need high IQ people to maintain infrastructure.
I can debunk this. Let me just debunk this, and then
Yeah.
we can answer your question, Jeff. In Africa, you have the state of Zimbabwe. If you look at their IQ, I believe you can go to Wikipedia and look like IQ rankings by nations. You'll see that Zimbabwe is not on the first 10. They started genocide against white farmers. If you look at South Africa, they're starting to do now. Most of the African nations have some sort of socialism, and they're also sparking the flames of ethnicity, but in order to kill whitey. They're trying to control the economy and do pretty much everything that makes a country be unsuccessful economically. And I remember you said earlier that people with the low IQ don't do genocide. If you need to study on the history of Africa, and you will change that opinion quite significantly.
Low IQ people can definitely do genocide. They just can't do it as efficiently as the Germans.
So yeah, I just wanted to say this is an open speech platform, and so don't feel ashamed when you refer to the gypsy people to say we, because I heard you talk about them and they. It's okay. Most people on the chat know that V is a gypsy.
No, I'm not.
What
a
I
gypsy.
wanna-
That's actually, I need to clarify this, right? Because some people
it's
actually
okay.
believe it. No, I understand it's an insult. It's insulting to call a Romanian a gypsy, right? And this is why this joke was attributed. But I want to clarify, genetically, I'm not a gypsy.
Oh,
Okay, so guys on the chat, V does not self-identify as a gypsy. V, I wanted to answer to your earlier question, which is about cultural inheritance and IDs versus genetics. What I suggested in my Multi-Buddha video is that we can essentially make abstraction of the whole division that we have in our head between race and ethnicity, and ultimately, the question of heritability is whatever passes from one generation to the other. And the fact of human life is that part of it passes through DNA, part of it passes through brain that copy cultural information. The brains are created by DNA and they exchange information during the raising of a child. And so ultimately we can have a more holistic view and say, does it really matter if it comes from DNA? Ultimately, these are all information structures that pass on generation through generation, and they do so in a way that respects the classical definition of a replicator, as Richard Dawkins refers to them. They are copyable parts of information that transfer from parents to offspring. And so it doesn't really matter if Muslims are Muslims because they are educated as Muslim, or because they have parts of their genetics are pre-adapted to record that information very well and to make them into good Muslims. Ultimately, what matters is when you see an individual, that individual carries information from previous generation in a way that predicts his behavior, his allegiance, and the way he conceives of the world.
I agree with this. I mean, the way I like to point it out is that I guess genetics does confine you to a certain degree. It's like playing a chess, but you have so many moves that at this point you can say that you have free will. But I'm not glad that you brought Muslims, because here's another interesting examples, right? You have countries like Iraq and Iran. If you look at them in the 80s and the 70s, when the ideology was different, you would not be able to tell the difference in those countries between a Western country and Iraq and Iran. And once you have the ideology that focused on religion, focused on the differences between people at the detriment of the state, you have the shitholes, which is Iraq and Iran today. And it's not even like, I wouldn't say it's even that far back, right? I mean, it's the same people who lived during the 70s and the 90s that are still alive today. And they notice like a huge difference in culture in their countries.
Hey, V, may I ask you something? V, are you, I know you're liberalist and all that. I've heard you and Sargon talking about this, but are you very pro-immigration? Because from what I hear, that the liberalist principles is that you guys don't look at race at all, right? Is that
yeah.
Yeah. So
well, I can give you an example, right? If you were to hire another moderator for your channel, and let's say you have a black guy, a Jewish guy, and a white guy, who would you hire?
Whoever's the best.
Exactly. That's the liberalist position, right? You look at the individual and you hire the best person for the job. If time and time again it seems that the white person is best, I don't fucking care. Okay, I don't look at the percentages and say whites are overly represented in this position. Doesn't matter. The only question that matters is, can a black person apply and take the test to verify if he's the best for the position? If the answer is yes, then there is no discrimination.
But do you believe that if we bring in like a ton of immigrants and it starts displacing white people, like for example, if we bring in, let's say, 500,000, Muslims, for example, into one certain area, wouldn't that displace the current culture of what's going on? You know what I mean?
The correct way of handling immigration in the past, and I'm talking when things were more common sense. If someone wants to immigrate, let's say you need a scientist, and let's say the scientist happens to be a Muslim, right? You have like someone from the 70s in Iraq or whatever, and he's really good. You look at his CV, he shows that he is the most qualified person for the job. Then you also need to make sure that he takes a test in the history of your nation, that he understands the culture of your nation. And if he ever fucks up, if he, for instance, starts demanding Sharia law on the streets, you deport him right away. It still does not have the same.
But if we have, let's say, like, unemployment, right, which we do in Canada and America, and we're bringing in a ton of immigrants who eventually take up those jobs that could have been given to people who are qualified in those positions, who are currently living in America or Canada. Isn't this screwing over the people that we have currently in North America?
That's not meritocratic immigration, is it? Because you're basically refusing to take people from the inside and you're taking people from the outside. Like what I would do is to be giving tax cuts to companies that hires people from the inside. I mean, that wouldn't be illiberal if you do something like that.
We have very interesting comments. So we have Garrett Green, $10 US, saying Gypsies and African Americans don't want their own nations because they have no definite territory to claim. Also, restore Rhodesia. And we have Dev James, 25, saying base black person here. The conflict in South Africa and Zimbabwe is simply ethnocentric blacks fighting the odd groups, parenthesis whites. V is blue pilled on race. Luke, I'd like to hear you about what V has been presenting here. It doesn't seem to me that the values that V is presenting are universal. For example, in local businesses, you have people who favor their family in employment. And it seems that part of life in Western civilization is about favoring your in-group against laws of market, but for rules of favoring your own genes and favoring your own family. Do you agree with what V has been presenting here?
No, if I hadn't shaved all my hair off, I'd be pulling it out as I listen to it. Like there are like so many whites who are so pathologically altruistic that they feel guilty preferring their own children to like some children in Africa or in China. Like pathological altruism is the flip side of the Northern Europeans, like openness to other cultures and kind of universal morality. But like even Orthodox Jews, like it's weird. Orthodox Jews, by and large, are more pro-white than even white people are. Like whites of Northern European heritage won't even take their own side in a fight. It's just so sick. But Greg Johnson, the editor of Countercurrents, and this is no philo-Semite, he said that probably 25% of Orthodox Jews, according to surveys, think that whites should, positively discriminate in favor of their own race in hiring, in neighborhoods, in schools, in all these things, while probably only 5% of whites are willing to discriminate because whites tend to look at people as individuals. Now, that's why, Anglo-Saxons have made the best countries, the high trust countries, at least when they were Anglo-Saxon countries, such as the United States of America. They played a big role in the development and creation of Canada, England, of course, and Australia and New Zealand, because they have this universal morality where there's not one different morality for how you treat the out-group as opposed to the in-group. So they make these wonderful countries, but then they allow in people who practice dual morality. Now, virtually everybody in the world practices dual morality except people of Northern European heritage. So dual morality means there's one moral standard for how you treat your in-group, and then there's a considerably more relaxed standard for how you treat out-groups. So it's not just Jews who practice dual morality, like Japanese and Chinese and virtually everyone. So there's a reason why the Anglo-Saxon countries are consistently the least corrupt countries in the world. Now, I'm not sure why Roman Catholics have not been able to create countries that are as low in corruption as the Anglo-Saxons. Maybe part of it's religion, part of it's ideology. I suspect most of it, of course, is genetic, because almost all predispositions, in politics and in the way that we bond with other people, have a large genetic component. So even our political reactions have a considerable biological component. So you'll find that identical twins raised separately will tend to have the same outlook on the world, the same type of politics, and the same sort of lifestyle choices, even though they had absolutely no environment in common, because genes are that powerful. And when it comes to IQ, like the major researchers say that IQ is like 80% genetic, and so you don't find any country in the world where blacks have higher IQs on average than East Asians or whites. Like in everywhere you go in the world where you have a sizable proportion to study, you'll find East Asians have the most family solidarity, the highest IQs of the three major races, the lowest rates of STDs, the longest lifespans. And then blacks will be on the other end of the spectrum. They'll have the most STDs, lowest IQ rates, the highest crime rates, lowest educational attainment, the lowest earnings. And then whites will be in between those two races, though much closer to the East Asians. This is a universal pattern. So if this was primarily ideological or free markets or religion, then you'd find a disruption to that pattern. But I can give you like 40 different life standards, and in every one of these 40 life standards, you'll find East Asians on one end, you'll find blacks on another end, and whites in the middle, tilted closer towards the East Asians.